Hey everyone, I'm Jessica. I've been on the podcast a few times now. These two have been my Agile coaches and product owner, and I come to them for most things. I provided them with a list of anti-patterns that I've seen exist over my past, 3 years in this space, and I wanted to discuss it with them. So here we are. We voted on items that we wanted to talk about first, and the first one is what we think of Scrum Master Managers. So this would be a manager who manages the Scrum Masters, but is also a Scrum Master themselves. What are your thoughts?
No such role in Agile. First of all, you don't need a manager in Agile who manages the Scrum Masters necessarily. Now, hierarchically, some organizations like that position because, let's face it, what is the Scrum Master going to do once they get good at their job? You're going to have to promote them up. And in those organizations, you're going to find if you take your macro lens and expand out, like zoom out, you'll find most people get promoted to their highest level of incompetence, unfortunately. Yes, I said that.
Wow. Brian, what are your thoughts?
Scrum Master Manager. That sounds expensive. I do have thoughts on this topic that are positive, that are not completely incendiary. I could see an organization having the need to employ like an enterprise agile coach who is a resource manager over the Scrum Masters. I'm using that word again. In the hierarchy in the organization, they would be the direct manager, reporting person, I don't know, whatever. Yeah. The person that hires the Scrum Masters, basically. To have a full-blown enterprise agile coach, someone who's done the role before at other organizations and understands what a Scrum Master should do to their teams. That makes total logical sense to me. I'm assuming that's not what we're talking about.
No, I think we're talking about more remnants of like PMO world where you have to have a manager, you have to have people that say, thou shall do things this way because everything's prescribed. You're given a folder, literally, right? Or virtually these days. You're given a folder that says, Scrum Master 101, this is what you do. You do this, you do this, you do this.
You do this status report.
Yeah, exactly. You ask these 3 questions, you stand up,
right?
Which you don't anymore. But anyway, those kinds of things are really the remnants of a PMO, a project management organization. And they're just trying to make that fit into the Agile space.
The other assumption here is that the Scrum Master Manager is a representative of some type of official that ensures standardization between Scrum Masters. I'm trying to think of the most evil way that I can implement a Scrum Master Manager, right? Which is I would put somebody in place to say, the Frederick Taylor way, a Scrum Master, which is all your Scrum Masters have to be executing their daily Scrums in the same cadence, same amount of time, the same procedure, running the calls the same way.
Are you segueing to our next topic?
No, I'm not. Yeah, I kind of am. Yeah, I kind of am. But I would assume that that's what this position is in charge of. This position wants to see. I want to see all the Scrum Masters, all the people who work for me. Let me go back hierarchically. All the people who work for me, because we're going back to PMO, right?
Right.
All the people who work for me, they need to show me their dashboards because I want to look at all their dashboards and I want to compare them against each other.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And I want to get there, and maybe we can put a bonus plan to this. Maybe the Scrum Master who improves the most, like, gets a bonus, and the other one's like, cut their pay in half or whatever. What other evil things can we do with this Scrum?
Yeah, there are so many anti-patterns just on that one sticky, believe it or not, right? So, but I want to go back to the essential core of that. The Scrum Master Manager is themselves a Scrum Master, we said, right?
Yep.
So here's the dichotomy of all this. Should be, right. So in many organizations, they are not. That's the problem. So in many organizations, they, again, going back to the PMO model, they are a PMO manager. They were a project manager 10 years ago, whenever, right? Now they're a PMO manager, and now they're managing Scrum Masters.
Yeah.
In the same way that they managed project managers X number of years ago, which is where that whole idea of standardization, and I know we have a sticky on that, but right, everybody's standard, everybody's a minion, so minion number 1, that's a Scrum Master, number 2, and then we're just gauging the performance of each of these against each other, right? Even though we all know these things can be gamed. So what are you measuring? Why are you measuring what you're measuring? Yeah. Those things come into the equation here. Scrum Master Manager is not a role in Agile. There is a role for somebody to turn to in case you need help as a Scrum Master.
Yeah.
Or in case you need, I hate that term resource, but in case you need a team member with a specific skill set. Say you need an architect on your team for a sprint or two, or you need a UX person for a couple of sprints, whatever it is. They're in a large organization, which is usually matrixed, right? You have people that these individuals with these skill sets report up to. Now, those people could be your go-to for getting those resources. Again, I said that word, right? Team members allocated to you.
Yeah.
Likewise, turning that around 180, you could be a person who reports to somebody who is basically allocating, dishing out Scrum Masters to various projects. That would be a Scrum Master Manager. But that would not be the person who judges your performance on a project, because they don't know what you do.
Right. Yeah.
Even if they're a Scrum Master.
This is the person giving the performance reviews, right, to their fellow Scrum Masters. And they were all once at the same level, right? So they brought someone up who had the most senior experience. And so it creates a very odd dynamic with the Scrum Masters that they used to work with and be a peer with. Right now, they're over them. Now they're coming in, just popping into meetings to observe, right? And they're obviously judging. They're judging your performance. So it can feel very invasive.
The irony of it is they have more experience as a Scrum Master, and yet they're coming in and, to your point, judging, which is exactly what you shouldn't be doing. Right? They should be discerning, not judging. This is something new that I just learned, at least recently, the distinction, right? Although some of the things I like to think I was doing before, but I didn't label it that way. So when you're judging, you're simply saying X is better than Y. When you're discerning, you're simply saying this is going better than this is. You're not judging. You're simply saying this is better than this. Why is that? Why is this worse than this? Not this person is doing better than this person necessarily.
The comparison of the teams.
Let me interject here for a moment. So Scrum Masters are going to exist in an organization. What is the ideal person they should report to? Somebody has to hire them. They have to work organizationally. That's just the way the organizations, the nature of organizations are.
Yeah.
Like, yes, they should work for the teams, and they should be employed for the teams, right? So, like, part of what I'm saying, I already know, like, well, it really shouldn't matter that much. But the reality of large organizations being what it is, who should they work for? What is the ideal individual that they roll up to? What does that look like? What's
That's
the
really
best?
Good question.
I think in Agile organizations, you have a couple of different models out there. You have a COP model, community of practice.
Yep.
You have a COE, community of, what's the E stand for, Brian? Excellence, right? So you have somebody who heads that up.
Only excellence on the Agile podcast.
That's right. You'll get it here, worth every penny you paid for.
That's right.
So this person who is running that community could be the person that takes the Scrum Masters under their wing. Not necessarily like owning them or anything like that, right? So the Scrum Masters, because they're together under that umbrella, they get better because they're just basically learning from one another, encouraged by this person at the top.
Yeah.
That's what or COP, community of practice,
it's
right?
a community. It's okay. Yeah. I could sign on to this.
That's interesting.
And here's something that I haven't seen work, but I haven't seen tried, I should say, which is why I haven't seen it work. But I would love to, which is that person who is you don't want to call them a manager. They're not managing anything really, right? They're kind of catalyzing all the Scrum Masters to work together. I'd like to see that role be rotated among all the Scrum Masters that you have in that sphere. So it's not a management role. It's not somebody making a decision that, Fred gets this amount of money because they earn their bonus and Mary doesn't. It's not that, right?
I got to tell you, I think that's like.
I love that. You take turns for accountability purposes.
I think that's a great idea because also, if you're the individual, let's say, leader of the department, right, the group, tribe, what are we getting into? If you're the person in charge organizationally in the hierarchy, it certainly does benefit you to distribute some of the responsibilities. Like you're probably constantly going to be interviewing people, and it does make a lot of sense to say, well, this month or in this 6-week period, the people I'm leaning on as my interview panel are Fred and Mary and Bob. Those are my Scrum Masters in the organization. And then 6 weeks from now, I'm going to trade that out and get 3 different Scrum Masters as my interview panel. So when they'll interview me, right? The enterprise agile coach kind of is running the community running. Shepherding, spearheading. I love the word spearheading. It's such a 90s, it's such a 90s term. Shepherding the community, servant leadering. There's no superlative that works.
No,
servant
there
leader.
isn't. But we get it.
But there's somebody, but it would be great because then they get to distribute what you think of normally in a normal hierarchical. I can't say hierarchical.
You just said
it's a
it.
hard word.
No, I can't.
You just said it.
Organization, distributing those what would be normally attributed to leadership level responsibilities in your organization, you're passing that around to people and letting them take ownership of it for a while and letting them get skills that otherwise maybe they wouldn't get. The ability to interview people.
Absolutely. I think one of the other biggest benefits is it really prevents the creation of these fiefdoms or kingdoms out there, right?
I prefer
somebody's
fiefdoms.
just like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go with this. This is me. This is my posse. No, you gotta break that through. That just doesn't work in the modern world.
Going back to the rotation, right? The rotation of that role, I think it's such a great idea because then it would come down to peer reviews, right? Everyone would be reviewing each other versus one manager who's doing that.
Yeah, well, so if we're going there, right, ideally, it should encompass also those that care the most about your deliverables, right, which is your customers. Mm-hmm. They should be able to say, at least they should have a variable in the equation, that says, yeah, we got value out of this, and they'll rank the team accordingly, not individuals, because I'm a firm believer that no one or two people can make a success out of a team. It is a team sport.
Yeah.
But the customer should be able to weigh in on that, not just your peers. That's my thesis.
Nice. Yeah.
This is a great topic because we've hit on something that a lot of people really don't think about. It's like, well, I got to have a Scrum Master to manage my Scrum Master. I've got to have somebody to manage my Scrum Masters. I mean, it makes a lot of sense to say, well, actually, you can move to like a distributed first among equals kind of model where you rotate the first among equals. Because every time somebody else comes, I don't like the time frame is arguable. We can probably go back and forth about the time frame.
Yeah.
But let's choose something out of the air for a second. 6 months. Out of the air. Boop. There it is. 6 months. You're the manager of the department. Like, imagine if you have employees. I mean, what is the average amount of time that people stay in a job? We probably could go to Google and figure it out. Like,
a couple of years.
2 years. I would say 2 years probably.
Yeah.
Like 6 months, like you're getting managerial experience basically for that window. Whereas otherwise, maybe you've never been exposed to managerial experience. How are you going to be exposed to managerial experience? In the traditional, what you would think of as managerial experience, you get rotated into the role, try some things, you get feedback with other members of the leadership. You know what I mean? Obviously, the leadership has to be open to it, right? Obviously, we've kind of assumed some things in the culture.
Absolutely.
But 6 months, you pass it on to somebody else, and now you can kind of talk to them about like, well, this is what I experienced. You talk to the other people. This is what I experienced when I was in the role. And maybe people stick around the company and you can kind of talk about, well, next time I'm in the role, I'll have a different take or I'll try different things or whatever. The big advantage of this, in my opinion, is something that we haven't talked about, which is now that you are kind of swapping in and out your Scrum Master, like first among equal Scrum Master with the air quotes leadership, okay? What happens is you end up exposing your Scrum Masters to a different level in the organization that they can be a change agent in. So you get, each of your Scrum Masters now get experience being exposed to the leadership team and being a change agent at the leadership level, whereas otherwise they'd just be working with a team and they'd be working inside of a program and they'd have all the frustrations of whatever working in the program. But now they get to be a change agent at the higher levels of the organization, which otherwise they may not get experience to. So when they rotate out of that role, they still maintain all their connections, all the rapport they've built with all the different members of the leadership team. And now they're a much more effective change agent for their team, pushing change out to the organization. So that's we haven't highlighted that specifically, so I wanted to touch on that before we moved on from this topic.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a fair point. And hopefully those people will also bubble up eventually to become members of that leadership team. That would be the hope.
That would be nice. So this it's a very interesting topic, which we probably could go the whole podcast talking about.
I'm so satisfied with what we got so far. I'm going to be honest.
I want to just finish this and bookend it with like an anecdote as well, right? So in the birds and animals kingdom, this happens a lot. So when you've seen birds go home at dusk, you'll see a V formation, right? What happens is there is a lead bird, and in the wake, that bird has two other birds, and each one of those two birds have two other birds. And they do it for two reasons. One is, scientifically, when you're flying in the wake, that's the most efficient way to fly because you have the least wind resistance. So if that was the only reason, you'd have the lead bird fly all the way home. But that doesn't happen. If you watch them long enough, what you're going to find is the lead bird then peels off and goes to the side and somebody else takes that role. So they rotate, which is what we're talking about here for the Scrum Master Manager role.
Yeah.
If it works for the birds, I think it can work here too.
I'm really satisfied. I thought that was a great one.
The next topic that we have has to do with standardization. You might hear this one occasionally, which is every team needs to have the same dashboards or tools or processes. Or I could take this one really far, where every team needs, like, all your story points need to be standardized. We can go super deep with this one.
So again, this is stemming from people who have project management background and experience, and they want to show leadership what the teams are doing. And leadership doesn't understand. The points all look different for them. The dashboards all look different. Just make everything look the same so I can understand the value that they're bringing.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd say this is going back to the earlier point we made, which is that whole PMO thing. Everybody has the same marching orders from the PMO head or the lead or whoever, whatever you want to call them, the head of the PMO leader. And then because they need to standardize everything in order to roll up these metrics up to leadership, they can't handle the fact that one team is doing things one way, another team's doing things another way. What they forget is the very premise of projects, which is where they kind of what they grew up with, which is every project is unique. So if every project is unique, and we already know that every project team is unique, then why would their dashboards, etc., be standardized? They must be unique to their teams, individual teams. It makes sense.
In the spirit of changing the Agile podcast title to Arguing Agile, I'll take the opposite side of this and say, what are the metrics that you would want to report on team by team? And not necessarily to compare, just, I don't even want to say metrics. I'll give you an example of what I'm thinking about. I wouldn't want to compare velocity team by team. Like, that's the first one everyone will go to. Well, you shouldn't compare velocity team by team. And yes, you shouldn't compare velocity team by team, because if you're doing that, you're a terrible person and Santa Claus is not going to give you any presents or whatever. Like, you shouldn't do that. Let's say I'm some kind of manager or whatever, and I want to make sure that all my product owners and on their teams have a backlog that's run out 2 sprints ahead of their teams. Okay, so that would be a backlog health metric.
Sure.
So I'm not looking at specific numbers. I just want to know, like, okay, well, your average story points, assuming you use story points for a second. Okay, we're going to make some assumptions for a second. Number one, your team has backlog.
Or a PO for that matter.
Or a PO for that matter.
Wait. You're laughing like that's happened before.
And we're gonna.
Wait, what? You're the product owner. How has that happened?
You stop. And we're gonna assume that you have a backlog with story points, using Scrum. You have a dedicated team. We're a bunch of assumptions. Okay, we just narrowed it down. Like so for the 10% of you that are left, it would be good to say, okay, well, for an automatic metric, how many points do you complete in a sprint? Okay, well, we complete 40 points in a sprint. Cool. Okay, well, aside from the sprint, do you have at least 80 points worth of refined work in your backlog. Let me go look at all the teams and just get that as a high-level metric. Sure. What percentage of my teams have at least the points of their I'm not saying to standardize a metric. I'm just saying take whatever their velocity is, figure out if they have 2 sprints worth of stuff, and then show me that in percentage. Would that be good to keep an eye on for a supervisory metric? I don't want to call it a PMO metric because it's not.
It's not a PMO metric for sure. But as far as that number or percentage or whatever, however you want to do this, right? Measuring the health of your backlog is always a good thing.
Yeah.
Because when you're falling behind, you need to be able to see that you're falling behind so that you can take remedial steps to get ahead again. Mm-hmm. So it's a good thing, right? That graph that you mentioned could have other criteria on it. And not necessarily with multiple teams, even a single team, right? Forget about velocity, first of all. So forget about it. That's like a speedometer. Nobody cares if you're driving from here to Orlando. Nobody really cares that you went from here to Lakeland at 45 miles an hour. What about why are the teams doing this in the first place? We're presumably trying to deliver some sort of value. So maybe that might be an option, is to plot business value delivered by sprint. Don't get held up into, we have to keep going up or we're dropping behind, because sometimes you have headwinds and you do drop behind. That's okay.
Yeah, but before we go to, I see you pushing us towards business value.
A little.
100%. I'm down to move to that as a byproduct of this conversation. But let me stop for a second and continue taking the other side of the discussion. What if I'm a manager and I happen to be looking at trends across teams, right? Or maybe I'm an enterprise. Actually, let me make this less confrontational and say I'm an enterprise agile coach, and all the Scrum Masters that I've hired on all the teams, maybe I've got 5, 6, 7, 10 teams or whatever in my program. I'm looking at a broad trend for all their teams, which basically is the story points that you commit to versus story points that you deliver, and I'm just looking for a percentage. Does your team overcommit? Do they undercommit? Let's just say that I ignore within 10%, up or down. I ignore that. I don't look at that. I consider up or down 10% equal. So I'm looking at standard deviations over 10%. Should I use that as a metric to take some kind of action?
Absolutely.
Okay, so like that falls under this standardization. There's bad standardization, but I don't feel that it would be right to represent standardization all as bad, because standardization means I'm looking at graphs and I want to, air quotes, standardize. If you're talking about standardization, meaning I should look at the broad trends, not even metrics, trends, and look at it from a trend level for my teams, I'm with you. I can have a conversation, and that's the conversation we're having now. If you're talking about all my teams, like the SAFE model, where like a 2 is double a 1, a 4 is double a 2, an 8 is double a 4. You know what I mean? Where every time you go up in story points, you double the effort of the previous story point, and then every single team should be aligned because they're all planning together in the same room. They should all be aligned on story points. Like that is not what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I get it. No, I agree with you. There are what I call indicators. So you could use that term to say, how is this team doing versus this team? You could do that. Mm-hmm. But there's other variables at play. This team may be brand new. This team may be established for the last year. Yeah. They work right together, whatever. Things like say-do ratio, to your point, commit to done, right? Yeah, you should definitely be looking at that. Any enterprise agile coach worth his salt will be looking, or her salt, will be looking at this going, how is this going, really? How are the teams progressing sprint on sprint? And if they're continuously missing on that trend line, there's causes underneath all of that, and that they should be diving into, right? Why is that? Is there been churn? Has there been some anchoring where people just don't speak up and they're overcommitting? There's so many variables there you can dig into.
What we're talking about with the Scrum Masters earlier in the conversation, having a distributed leadership model.
Yeah.
The advantage here of the distributed model should be, you should be able to look at the other team's metrics and see that you have another team. Like Jessica, if you have another team in your program and they always hit their number, you should be able to go over to the Scrum Master and be like, what are you guys doing? Like, can I drop in occasionally to some of your planning, backlog refinement, or whatever, just to see, like, you guys are always hitting your numbers. You know what I mean? They're in a distributed model, the free market version of the distributed model, the selling point, and the reason it continues to be successful is when one team starts developing success over and above all the rest of the teams, everybody should turn and look and try to figure out what that team is doing that they're not doing, and then adopt the better practices that team is doing that you're not doing.
To emulate the behavior.
Yeah. Like, do you, like, in the standardization and the previous Scrum Master Manager model, if you had the appropriate person as the Scrum Master, air quotes, manager, they would be pushing you to do this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if you have a PMO type, which we talked about, like, they're not going to care. They're not even going to, you know what I mean? Their mind's not there. Do you feel any of that is going on? Do you have anyone pushing you to say, these people are doing a good job, go figure out what they're doing, and then figure out how to take that back to your team? Is there anyone pushing you in that direction?
Well, those Scrum Masters, I guess, will get promoted to the Scrum Master Manager role. So.
And then they cease doing a good job.
Well, yeah, we're back in that PMO model. But there are other indicators that you could use to see how the teams are doing. Quality metrics is one of them. What's your quality throughput been like, right? Relatively speaking, because every team's producing a different and a unique product. But overall, you could see that there are so many escape defects happening from one team versus another. You know, missed requirements, right? Misunderstandings, all of these things. Really just coming down to identifying the causal factors and then remediating those to incrementally get better. But that rotation model we discussed does one other thing, which is if you have the other model, one person doing things the same way, then their errors keep compounding, right? But if you're rotating, those errors cancel out because everybody's going through that. So one person is doing it one way, okay, that might skew the needle a little bit, but then eventually, because everyone's doing it their own unique way, that needle is going to be more to the middle than it is to the left or right over time. So that's a big benefit.
Yeah. So what I heard you guys say so far is paying attention to the backlog, right? How healthy is your backlog? How many sprints ahead is it, right? And then also the defects, right? And that's very telling of the health of the team. Now, I want to take it a step further, if you guys don't mind. If as a Scrum Master, you see that you continuously, despite, you know, how many refinements you have or whatever, you're still not able to create a healthy backlog, what are your usual next steps?
So you've got refinements happening, which is a good thing to begin with. You don't have healthy backlogs still, right? You've got the adequate amount of time that the team is spending on refinement. The Scrum Guide doesn't say that the refinement is a sprint event, right? It says it's a sprint activity, which the guidance there is the team can spend up to, but less than 10% of the sprint.
Yeah.
Right? So my first question is, are they spending a reasonable amount of time doing the refinement, or is it just an hour here, an hour there, and we're done sort of thing? That's one thing to look at. Are you doing the due diligence on refinement? The other thing is you still don't have a backlog. So do you have a product owner who is actually prioritizing your backlog, saying, look at these things first, right? And the BAs and everybody else on the team is refining those items. Is that happening, right? So that's another thing to look at. Are your requirements that are being captured by presumably the product owners or the business analysts, are they clear enough where the team can have a meaningful dialogue? Or are they still fuzzy and then they have to be taken back and brought back again? But you've just spent an hour in refinement, but you really didn't refine anything. Is that happening, right? So those are the sorts of things to look at.
Yeah. And I want to speak from what I'm currently experiencing too, is that we are having refinements. We're having that space. We have our product team members meeting with the business on a weekly basis, having good conversations, but not enough stories are coming out of those conversations. Not enough to bring it to the team. So now we're looking at it as, all right, so maybe there's just not enough work in the pipeline. Maybe we need to get rid of some of these team members or move them to other teams that are more demanding. I'm not sure.
Maybe. Or maybe you have to spend more time in refinement. Every time I join a company, I feel I go through the same kind of process, which is I have to work their backlog up to 2-3 sprints ahead. That number really has a star next to it because it depends on the company. I would like to have 2 sprints of work in the backlog ahead of where the team's at in their current sprint, refined and ready to go for people to pick up. Now, the reality, it depends on where it's really product I'm talking about. It depends on where the state of product is at. If product is not at a real mature state and things come in and bump work all the time and kind of kick things out or whatever, then it doesn't make a lot of sense to go more than one sprint ahead because your priorities are thrashing a lot. Oh, we're trying to sell this customer, or we got to respond to this, or Android put out a new update or whatever. We got to stop what we're doing. Or, like if you're not really thinking ahead too far in the future and that stuff surprises you a lot, especially technology stuff surprises you a lot, then yeah, maybe you want to be more reactionary. But in order to build up to a point where you're 2 sprints ahead, sometimes you have to do more backlog refinements.
Yeah.
Until you get to a point where you can maintain it, and then you can wheel it back. That's where I'm at now. I'm like, well, maybe I need to do 2 backlog refinements a week rather than 1 backlog refinement a week. Because I remember when I joined a company one time, I did an hour and a half backlog refinement every week, hour and a half on Monday, to a point where we were 2 sprints ahead. And then I rolled it back to 1.5 hours every sprint. Our sprint was 2 weeks at that company. So basically, I doubled up backlog refinements until I felt the backlog was at a proper state, and then I cut them in half, and I went down to just what I needed to maintain. And that's when I left the company. That was what we were doing.
I think it's a very prudent approach. I mean, if you did 2 hours twice a week, you'd still be where the Scrum Guide says you should be, right?
Yeah.
You're still not going over.
Right.
Initially. I'm not saying you can sustain that, but
right.
initially, right, to your point. To the point where you get enough in the hopper, then you can start, like you say, just like easing off on the throttle, right?
Yeah.
So you could say, let's do 2 hours twice a week.
Yeah.
What some teams do is this. Some teams will do a separate meeting. These 2 meetings will be separate. There's still refinement at the end of the day, but what they'll say is that the first one will be with the business to really understand the what. And then the second one, the business is optional. They can be there to answer questions, clarifying questions. But the team is then figuring out, do we understand enough, right? So that's another hybrid approach. Again, no one's saying if this is good or bad. I've seen it happen, and it worked in this specific case. So think about that.
Well, I want to ask you too, how do you get enough stories written for the team? Because you can have as many refinements as you want. If you don't have stories ready, there's no point of the refinement, right? So what do you do as a product owner to make sure that you're prepared and have these quality stories for them?
I just went through this, so it's super fresh in my mind. The writing of the acceptance criteria is that was the topic of last podcast. The writing up of the acceptance criteria is the special sauce that goes into writing the story, because that's the team and my agreement with each other of this is what it takes to deliver the actual story and call it done. So I can write the as whatever I want, some functionality because I'm trying to do some business thing or whatever. I can write that super fast as a product owner. But when it comes to writing acceptance criteria, I have 2 ways of doing things, which I talked about in the last podcast that we did. Number 1 is I'll write a draft of what I think the acceptance criteria is going to be, right? That's number 1. I'll write a draft, I'll bring it to the team, and I'll say, this is what I think the acceptance criteria is. Let's talk about it. Maybe we rewrite it. Maybe we come to a point where we need to split the acceptance criteria out and make separate stories because it's a lot of stuff. Maybe the teams identify more, say, AC, right? The other way I do it is I don't write any acceptance criteria. I write acceptance criteria, AC here. And then I put a little parentheses, a question mark, parentheses in Jira, so it shows up as a nice blue check mark. So the team knows that I haven't put anything. And I'm like, what do you guys think?
So when I was a product owner, and before we started using these virtual tools, we had tools, but we would have stickies. I mean, we would have cards that we would write the story on, right? And on the back side of the card, upside down, right, I would write the acceptance criteria that I thought fit the card. The reason why it's upside down is because when you put that on a wall with a little tape, then it's easy to read when you flip it up like that. Anyway, the team would then come up with their own acceptance criteria, and we would collectively discuss what they came up with what I wrote. Sometimes I'd just say, oh God, I don't know what I was thinking, right? So dismiss that. Or we'd glob them together and come up with what everybody agrees to be the AC for that story. And that conversation could be pretty quick. It doesn't have to take too long, right? A question I have for you. You don't have enough stories in the backlog, right? So is it because your product owners aren't writing the stories, or are the stories too big? Do they need to be broken up in some way? Or what are some of the things you've seen?
The product owners aren't writing enough stories. They aren't able to bring enough stories to our refinements, to our team. It's a struggle every sprint to get enough work for the team to do in that sprint. And I look at the business. I try to sit in some of those meetings when I have the ability to, and it sounds like the business doesn't exactly know what they need either. So at that point, I'm wondering, do I need a journey mapping session? What can I do?
You do.
Well, maybe. Like, I'll bring my product owner to this discussion, because usually when you develop functionality, bring it to a software engineering team, usually you have a epic, some kind of higher level item of what you want to get done with general business goals, right? Generally, unless you're under development.
Yeah.
And then development just tells you, because they know what to
best.
do.
Always.
They know what to do. But let's pretend we're living in a normal world. I was like, at an epic level, you have a thing that you want. I want customers to be able to do X, Y, Z, whatever it is. I was like, you can, again, this is why I've been telling people as Scrum Masters that are like, I don't understand my product people, whatever. I was like, go read the Marty Kagan inspired book. The reason is you will start understanding, like, that epic, when you start with that huge business case. An epic is a business case, and that's kind of how I think of it, right? Because an epic is not something you can do in just one sprint and just knock out quick in a little. Yeah, right. Unless you have several teams swarming and dealing with it. So what I tell them is, before you proceed with that giant business case of an epic, many stories, you might be able to write all those stories, but the starting idea is, I want to validate if this is feasible. I want to validate if customers will use this, if this is viable in my field. So those little tiny things, you should be able to do those quickly, a couple days, maybe at the most, to get customer feedback to prove that your idea that you're about to spend sprints worth of effort on is even something people will use. And there should be metrics for that. Even if you can't have quantitative metrics, you should have some good qualitative metrics to lead you in that direction. Some kind of metric to lead you in that direction. Because otherwise, you're building stuff because somebody at the company, some highest paid person in the room, a Hippo user or whatever, is like, I say we need to do that. I know what the customers need, and I'm willing to bet 15 sprints worth of development effort across 3 teams that I'm right. And then when they're wrong, it was that guy's fault.
Ew.
Absolutely. The last time I remember this really working out well, when somebody said, we know what the customer wants. Right. That was when Steve Jobs came up with the iPod. The guy was a visionary. How often does that happen? Right? Not very often. So I agree with you on that 100%. But here's the thing. What I've seen in practice is some companies will say, yeah, we need to do this quick POC, early market testing, whatever they call it. And then they staff up this group of, what's the word they use for that? Focus group, right? And the focus group has no customers in it. And so they say, the focus group says we should do this. It will validate our idea. So we're going to build this. And then nobody buys it because you didn't have real customers in there to begin with.
Right.
So you can't shortcut that. You have to have customers look at this early stuff.
Right.
It's raw, it's rough, whatever it is, that's fine. Set it up that way. But all you're trying to answer is not how well it works, but would you buy it? Will somebody pay good money for this stuff? Mm-hmm. That's the only question, right?
Yeah. Again, I told Om before we started, I was like, I had to check myself when I gave somebody a Scrum Master, when I gave them that advice. You need to be a more knowledgeable, better read product owner than your current product owner.
As a Scrum Master?
Yes, yeah.
So there's an expectation.
Yeah, well,
once the Scrum Master is certified, once they go through that certification, that they're now suddenly a coach and that they can play the product owner role. Okay.
Well, the Scrum Guide says that you're supposed to coach the product owner. How are you going to do that if you don't understand what a product owner does?
I think we're not setting them up for success after the certification, but that's a different podcast episode.
Bingo. Yes, indeed. That will be coming.
So I also want to talk about sprint reviews. Product pushback. Why is this valuable?
Yeah, absolutely. In a previous situation I was in, they didn't They consistently push back on the sprint review. They didn't see it as a good use of their time. The product owners knew what the team completed that sprint. So why review it again? Stakeholders didn't want to participate in this meeting because if they don't see the full feature, they don't see how it's valuable for them to even participate and see that. So curious of your thoughts.
Wow. So first of all, a sprint review can take a number of different forms, right? Sometimes what I've seen is developers bring up some kind of tool, SQL Management Studio, for instance, and just shows queries. That's not really what the stakeholders are interested in. They're interested in a product increment that should be delivered at the end of every sprint. So in other words, something that's usable piece of functionality. So if it's an e-commerce thing, you could say, well, we need to be able to browse from a list of 15 million products that we want something, right? And pick it and put it in a cart and then check out, pay for it with a credit card or whatever, or however. We need to do all of those things. Well, a sprint might just be, we can browse 15 million items. Look, we can do that. That's enough, right? That's not the full solution, but it's part of the solution. So two things there. First of all, is your team demonstrating a working product? Or is it just some screens that a developer can mock up and say, pretend there'll be real data here one day? That's horizontal slicing. The other part of it is, do the stakeholders have a vision of what this thing will do? And that falls directly in the wheelhouse of the product owner, who is working for the stakeholders after all, right? They should be conveying to the stakeholders, this is how the product's going to look like when it's finished. We're only seeing a slice of that. But are we moving along the right track? That's the whole point of the review anyway, to get feedback. Yeah. This is not a finished product, first of all, right? So when the stakeholders say we don't see any value until we see the whole thing, it's like, there's only one thing wrong with that. When we show you the whole thing, you're going to find 15 things wrong with how it's built. So why don't we just look at this one piece now and you tell us? It's like if you ever build a home, you don't go to that house once the builder says, come on in and let's just do a final walkthrough. If you do that, you're going to find things are wrong, they're misinterpreted or whatever. Whereas if you go in early, the foundations board, you could say, well, I want my bathroom over there because they have to get the plumbing into the base, right? The concrete slab. So you could have it your way if you have frequent inspections along the way, your own feedback. And that's the whole point. That's why we have stakeholders there. So I think all around, the product owner orchestrates that. They should be the one demonstrating the value, but they have to lay out a vision as well. Yeah. And the teams have to do their part by showing real finished product, not death by PowerPoint. I absolutely abhor that. When someone shows
know
PowerPoints.
You do, and I love that about you.
Yeah, I'm struggling to find a way to take the counterpoint here in the arguing Agile spirit.
Be a stakeholder.
I guess if you're a product owner and you don't like the way that the stories are written or the stories are being done, or you think they're too technical, but maybe you don't want to confront your team about it or whatever, then yeah, maybe you don't feel that each story has value. I guess my point is, if you're the product owner and somehow you don't feel that the way the stories are written have value, maybe that could contribute to this. I mean, like the stories, making sure the stories have value is kind of the product owner's job.
Right.
So like that's a tough one for me to present the counterpoint. I've seen a lot of teams who are, because the engineering managers or a CTO or some kind of influence in the organization make them component teams. In that case, until all the components are delivered together, yes, they do not have value. So in that case, by the way the system is designed at that company, nothing being delivered has value. That's out of the product owner's hands to a point. We'll get to that in a second. Let me put that on the back burner. That's out of the product owner's hands. So in that case, I could understand. Like if you have a front end, back end team, back end delivers a bunch of stuff. We've made this API endpoint. I don't care. Our customers aren't exposed to the API. I don't want to see any of this. Until my front end team shows me a UI, I'm not interested in seeing it. I don't want to bring my customers in. I don't want to see SQL, SSMS. I don't want to see it. Maybe I don't work on a data product. Maybe I don't know anything about SQL. I don't know anything about APIs. All the customers we have that deal with our product deal with it through a UI front end. So I'm going to bring my designer, and if my designer and I can't come to a review and understand what's happened, I'm checked. I'm checked out. that's an example, right?
That's a valid example. I think it is a tricky thing to make sure that you're demonstrating to stakeholders something that has real business value to them, right? So I'm going to take an example, building an aircraft. You're building an aircraft. So there are a million components to an aircraft. There are modules, right? Big modules like hydraulics and avionics and whatever. So each component, you could say, doesn't really add value because you don't see the whole aircraft. And even if you see it on the ground, you say, well, does this thing really take off and land? That's the wrong thinking, because you're never going to get to the point where 100 tons of steel will be airborne in a controlled manner, right? Every module has value, but the stakeholders have to buy into that. Yep. So there is somebody higher up, necessarily in the organization, in my example here, higher up, who could say, here's how these modules fit together. Unless we have hydraulics, all the mechanics do nothing. Unless we have avionics, nothing moves because there's no instructions going back and forth. There's no processing going on. These things fit together well.
Oh, thanks.
Right? So I think conveying that kind of I'm going to use that term, a product vision, right, is the part of, it's maybe a product manager, because we talked about the difference between a product manager and product owner. Maybe it's the product manager's role to convey that vision, right, of the product, how it's going to work.
But I would say, so that's a great example, because in that example, like maybe the product people in the example that we've given, maybe they're not aligned at the right positions, because I would expect that you'd have some kind of product manager who's in charge of, I don't know how to slice an airplane, but maybe you have a product manager who's involved with all the hydraulic systems on an airplane, which is a lot of systems.
Sure.
It's steering, brakes, landing gear, like all the flaps, you know what I mean? Tons of systems. But maybe you have one product owner who, yes, they can't, air quotes, see their product until the plane is live and is on a real runway or whatever. But on the other hand, like if they're only concerned with the hydraulics, they most certainly can get a demo on all the pieces of the hydraulics, because they know how their pieces. They're going. Basically, what I'm saying is they go to some sort of integrated product environment later where they understand how their product fits into the entire system. So they understand what the vision for the whole system is. They understand what the whole aircraft together looks like, even if they don't know all the electronic components or whatever, because their job is hydraulics. They understand how their job integrates with the rest of it. So then when they go to that scaled, I'll call it scaled. When they go to that scaled product management circle, I like saying circle a lot.
Circles are good.
When they go to join that product management circle, they can talk all about their, air quotes, product, which is the hydraulics of the system. And then they can talk with the software guy who's like, well, I've got to make sure the hydraulics plug into the software, and we're monitoring this and we're monitoring that or whatever. And he can answer all their questions. But they're plugging into the larger system overview, and they can be a subject matter expert. Maybe they're not even the product person at that point. Maybe there's another scaled product person at that point.
Right.
But the point is they live inside of a system ecosystem. It doesn't matter how complex or how componentized their product is. Oh boy, what are we talking about?
No, listen, you nailed it. So in the aircraft world, you have prototypes. And and you have many. You don't have just one. So one prototype might be hydraulics, and everything else around it is mocked up. The avionics is even mocked up, even though there's in parallel, of course. Right? The avionics team is working on that stuff, but they will literally just have buttons that you can press, and they do nothing. They simply say, imagine this button was a signal coming down to move the ailerons up and down.
It's my life.
Right?
Buttons that do nothing.
Yeah, and then so the hydraulics people would have to demonstrate, receiving this, we'd have to do this, and it would go like this or like this. So stitching it all together. But to your earlier point, is there somebody overacting, looking at this stuff? They do have somebody like that. Right? So they have product managers for these components or modules, they call them. And all these people work together hand in glove.
Yeah, but to take it back to the actual topic, we had to go around the world for me to remember what the topic was. To that point, in the hydraulic example, this is probably the furthest way we can get from software, which is integrated components, your component teams, but you actually have a purpose for being component teams, but you're going to plug into a system. At that point, a piece of a hydraulics are done, it's going to plug in to all the rest of the. So you have somebody from the other teams establishing the hydraulic components, but then you have somebody at the program level who knows how your stuff is going to plug into the program. So you could be demoing to them. You don't need to be demoing to a airline customer who's going to buy a ticket and get on a plane. No. Yeah, like not necessarily. Maybe you can demo to them to say, when it lands, maybe you won't feel a big bump. Maybe you can deal with them, but most likely not. You'll be dealing with, it'll be like air quotes internal customers, right? Maybe. I mean, there's a big maybe about that, a big star next to it. But there are people that you can find that will find value out of every air quotes component that you're delivering in the model that we're talking about now. And I realize I'm defending components, so I really want to be done with this discussion. But saying I don't see any value in what the team's delivering, like that's a huge red flag that needs to be dealt with separately from what we're talking about. Like there's no value because the stories are not written in a valuable way. There's no value because the team is delivering a piece of the story, or the team isn't delivering exactly what you asked for. And it isn't meeting the acceptance criteria, so we have to go back to planning when it's delivered to renegotiate. I have a lot of questions. I have more questions from this that will lead us to keep beating this one up. So,
well, an opposing view. Yeah. Just so I can add that.
Please.
Right. So the opposing view is product will say something like, we meet with the business every week. We tell them the progress of things. They tell us what they need. If we're good at our job, we should be able to do what they wanted. That's why the stakeholders don't attend the sprint reviews. It's not beneficial to them because I, as the product owner, am doing my job.
I'll jump on this one before you jump on this one.
Yeah, no, I was just ready to.
No, because on this podcast, you're the enterprise agile coach, and I'm the angry person.
I play one on TV.
Random angry person on the street. What am I doing with my life?
Product. Just say product.
As the product person on the podcast, I have to point out, like if your job is I meet with the stakeholders and I know what they want, and you don't need to talk to them, and I don't need to show them anything. Like, you might be in the wrong job, because if you don't like communicating with stakeholders and showing them things, you might be in the wrong job. I'm trying not to curse. It's real hard, this podcast. The point of why I said like you should read the Marty Kagan Inspired book is you should always be engaging your customers to show them the functionality, because the idea is like it's not a focus group, right. It's a working session. Because a focus group is I'm presenting stuff to you and getting your feedback, like written form or whatever. Right? That's not what it is.
No, it's
what it is let me show you the working software, and let me make sure that camera's on. And I've told my team this, so they know what to expect out of a sprint review with me. I was like, what I want everyone on the team to have their camera on, so that the customer feels pressured to have their camera on, so that when we show them the software, I can see the look on their face before they say anything, and I can remember and write down the look on their face when they saw the feature. Because if they're just like kind of blasé about it, I'm like, well, they don't really care that much. But if they're like,
you got a delighter on your hand.
I got a delighter. I'll put that in the delighter category, and that'll be amazing. It would be tragic if that never got back to the development team. They were just punching out cogs in a machine, and they had no idea what the customer was happy about, what the customer just kind of was like, I don't really like the development team needs that feedback. It is integral to what they're doing, and that is part of just like writing stories and prioritizing the backlog, that is an integral part of the product owner on the Scrum team's job.
It's the fuel
if
for
they're
developers.
If they're not doing that, like I, as the whatever director, product, whatever I am in the hierarchical in the organization, I did it again. Except I nailed the word this time.
You got it, man. You got it.
And then I took the afternoon off to celebrate myself. So, like I should be inspecting my product owners to say like, who's not getting it, who doesn't care about that. Like, no matter what the customer says, I'm right.
Yeah.
Are you really? Like,
exactly. How do we know?
How are you checking your biases to know that you're right? Not with any metrics.
It goes back to the basics of the sprint review, though, right? I mean, ultimately, the purpose is to get feedback from the stakeholders.
Correct.
So if you're not getting that, you're not doing the right thing by the event at least.
Yeah.
And if the product owner swears up and down, yeah, we talk to them every week or every day, it doesn't really matter, right? And we know what they want, so they really have no interest. That's the wrong type of product owner.
No.
Honestly.
Now we touched on this in a different podcast. We talked about what happens if you break up your sprint review into little micro sessions.
Well, that's the next level of abstraction. Yeah, that would be awesome.
So every 3 days,
like the next level.
Yeah, every 2 or 3 days, like as my team finishes a story, rather than waiting till 2 weeks or whatever, as my team finishes a story, I get the customer on the phone. I just pull them together ad hoc, maybe at the end of our daily stand-up or whatever. I add the customer in the last 2 minutes or whatever daily stand, and then take 10 minutes, 15 minutes, run over what we've done, get their feedback real quick, get them off the phone, adjust the backlog based on what we talked about, and then now we're in a rhythm. Now we're not waiting to the end of the sprint. I'm adjusting the backlog. You know what I mean? Doing things, and we get on a natural cycle where the customer, they're basically coming into our stand-up.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of in-sprint reviews like that, like frequent introspections, right? Introspections. Yeah, so I'm a big fan of that, but I've never seen it work, or I've never seen it executed all that well. And that's because of how it's sold. People are used to, we'll see you at the end of the sprint. It's like, why? We'll see you tomorrow because we have something to show you.
Dude, honestly, I feel just the pace that you could set of like, we're done with this feature. Let's get the customer now. Mm-hmm. Okay, especially if you're like in whatever your tracking system, Jira or VSCS, whatever you're using. If you can put the customer as like a field in the story, to say this story as a specific customer, or whatever.
Persona.
If you can put the customer in your persona and then you know who to contact for that persona, if you can put that in your story, you know who to call when that story is over, you can immediately start the wheel moving or whatever, the ball rolling. I don't know what euphemism I want to use here. You can immediately start that feedback cycle. Start the feedback cycle. And you don't need to wait to the end of the sprint.
Absolutely.
You get it right away.
In your done column, when a story hits your done column, it should show who the persona is right there on the board. Right. And that way the team can say, well, this one's done. Now we need to show it to somebody to make sure it's really, really done.
Well, you show it to your product owners, right, for PO acceptance. But I'm sure you're, in this case, like you mentioned, the product owner would probably use their discernment to determine, is this valuable enough for a stakeholder, a customer to view right now? I mean, if the team just created a button, you'd probably be like, they don't need to see this right now.
I mean, maybe. Or a 5-minute phone call. Or not even a 5-minute phone call. Send them if it's like changing the color of a button or whatever. You can do the before and after, put it in an email and send it out, and then you don't need to interrupt anyone if it's something like that. But I would also argue you could do that before your team even starts working on it. And now you don't need to spend a development effort on something like that. So you already have the answer before you start working on a ticket like that. So it's like there's a lot of ways to dig into this from a bunch of different angles. I'm trying to wrap it up gracefully.
Let me put a bow on it. So that's a great example. If you mock up a couple of buttons and send it to them, here's a real example from my experience. The feedback from the customer was, that's great, except the colors. We need to change the colors because it's not ADA compliant.
Sure.
The team never thought of that.
Yeah.
So that would have been refactoring later on had we not got the feedback up front.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Anyway.
This is on the product person to knock down risk before the development team picks up an item. That's a product person's job. But most companies will build the entire feature and then send it out for testing / to the customer / whatever release before they get feedback on it to fix it or whatever.
Right.
But all that stuff should have been decided before the development team picked it up and worked on it. You're basically you're going through the process of building something before you test if it works for the customer. And that's the most expensive method of testing the viability of a feature.
Get your customers test it, you mean?
Get your customers to test it after you've committed to building it. You spend all your development effort to build it.
UAT?
So, yeah. Or if you have some kind of internal process or whatever. Yeah, almost every shop I've ever been in, they do that. They assume the risk and just eat the risk and, you know, blame it on somebody afterwards or whatever. Like, how come we built this? Blah, blah, blah. How come customers aren't using it? No, you should have known that before you started building it.
Yep.
You know, and it would have been pretty easy to do it, except, again, most shops have that roadmap that's built by highest paid person or whatever. And
the PMO.
Yeah, they're not gonna accept the responsibility when it fails, basically.
No, it's the dev team's responsibility.
Well, I like to move on in an all-time low, like we're at now.
Well, I was hoping he'd bring in a nice animal analogy. Wrap this
With
up.
that one, I don't think I have one.
No animals?
With that one, no. No animals were harmed
Watch
in
the
the
review.
analogy that
Well,
we knocked down.
this was a fun topic. How can we summarize this topic?
Anti-patterns. Why we shouldn't do these things. And how to influence positive change. Thanks, guys.
Awesome.
We'll meet again.
Those of you that are still here, thank you for hanging in with us. Don't forget to smash that like button.
This tea, I want to say it earlier, but this tea, it smells like, it tastes like hotel soap.
Oh, I was thinking,
God.
I